Soon after Wollstonecraft's death, Godwin wrote an account, a memoir, which was published the following year under the name of Memoirs of the Author of a Vindication of the Rights of Woman. It served only to fan the flames of scandal. In it, Godwin recounted Mary's affairs, the illegitimate birth of Fanny, her suicide attempts, her unorthodox arrangement in their marriage, her daring views and values. Robert Southey, the poet, described him as stripping his dead wife naked. Well, this is just a brief biographical sketch of a life that was both short and breathtakingly productive. But these events, of course, in themselves are not what has made Mary Wollstonecraft a person of enduring importance, a key thinker. But I would not, on the other hand, want to minimise the biographical. The life experience of great people is not always relevant to their thinking, nor even always inspirational. But in Wollstonecraft's case, her life has particular significance. She lived her own ideas and inspired others in doing so. At the same time, she also lived and suffered the fate of women, and to know this is to bring the ideas down from the abstract to the real, the urgent. Ideas of liberation can be derived from abstract principles, but they can never be detached from the reality, the need for liberation. Still, of course, it is through her writings that we know her, and in particular through her vindication of rights. So, the vindications. In 1790, Wollstonecraft read Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. It denounced the revolutionaries and the English radicals who supported the revolution, defended tradition and the church, and condemned deliberate non-evolutionary change in a country's constitution. Burke's work sparked a number of responses and generated the so-called revolution controversy. Wollstonecraft's was one of the first replies. Her Vindication of the Rights of Men was written in a matter of weeks and published the same year in the form of a letter to Burke. Her work ranges across many subjects, including Burke's theories of sentiments and religion, the right to property, education, and principles of social class and order. Above all, it is a defence of equality, of benevolent government and enlightened thinking. She uses the word enlightened, with deliberate italics. Inequality, she writes, blasts all these prospects. Virtue can only flourish amongst equals. The unequal are degraded by the habits of their lives. Rights and virtues, she writes, cannot be drawn from tradition, but must be derived from reason. Wollstonecraft challenged Burke with a depiction of the miseries and degradations of the poor and the debaucheries of the rich and powerful. She depicts the envy and hatred experienced by the poor towards their superiors who, as she says, step aside to avoid the loathsome sight of human misery. With excoriating language, she accuses Burke of blind loyalty to the English constitution, a loyalty which she says resembles the brutal affection of those who think it is a duty to love their relations with a blind, indolent tenderness that will not see the faults as the faults it might assist to correct if their affection had been built on rational grounds. Although she uses the term men in this context, it is intended in many places, at least in the work, as the generic universal, something, by the way, that we now recognise as a false universal. And she also, in this vindication, includes observations about the inequality of women and their subordination and subjugation in marriage. It is no surprise that she soon turned to the rights of woman. She was prompted again by another declaration, this time Talleyrand's report on public education presented to the French National Assembly in 1791. In the same year as the French feminist Olympe de Gouges, Wollstonecraft's French counterpart, we might say, wrote a declaration of the rights of woman and the female citizen, a feminist reconfiguring of the rights of man and the citizen. In that same year, Talleyrand announced, "Women should not be brought up to aspire to advantages which the Constitution denies them, but to know and appreciate those which it guarantees them. Men are destined to live on the world's stage. A public education suits them. The paternal home is better for the education of women. They have less need to learn to deal with the interests of others than to accustom themselves to a calm and secluded life." Wollstonecraft didn't agree. She dedicated her second vindication to Talleyrand, expressing in her preface an ardent hope that he would be enlightened, that he would be induced to reconsider his views, and he would recognise that the principles of freedom and equality for which he would recognise the principles of freedom and equality for which the revolutionaries stood. My main argument, she wrote, is built on this simple principle that if woman be not prepared by education to become the companion of man, she will stop the progress of knowledge and virtue, for truth must be common to all, or it will be inefficacious. And how can woman be expected to cooperate unless she knows why she ought to be virtuous, unless freedom strengthens her reason? But the education and situation of women at present shuts her out from such investigations. Wollstonecraft hoped, she said, that when the French Constitution was revised, the rights of woman may be respected if it be fully proved that reason calls for this respect and loudly demands justice for one half of the human race. The first theme of her vindication then follows, an analysis of the source of rights. Rights are natural, given by God, Wollstonecraft argues, conferred upon human beings, and it is an affront to God's purpose for one half of humankind to deny rights to others, to the other. Her principal theme then is developed. Girls and women have a right to be educated. If they appear ill-suited to education, as Talleyrand had declared, or physiologically incapable, as Rousseau claimed in his work, Émile, this was the very effect of the lack of education itself. Rousseau was indeed to be the principal target of this vindication. Wollstonecraft spends the better part of a chapter quoting from his work and rebutting his assertions. She acknowledges that women are perceived as inferior and in cases themselves act as if this perception were accurate. She explains this. In a system of education that only prepares women for marriage and that encourages vanity, coquetry and small-mindedness, men will complain, and with reason, of the follies and caprices of women. When they do not keenly satirise our headstrong passions and grovelling vices, behold, I answer, the natural effect of ignorance. The mind will ever be unstable that has only prejudices to rest on. Women are told from their infancy and taught by the example of their mothers that a little knowledge of human weakness, justly termed cunning, softness of temper, outward obedience, and a scrupulous attention to a puerile kind of propriety will attain for them the protection of man. And should they be beautiful, everything else is needless for at least 20 years of their lives. Woman's education, Wollstonecraft wrote, would not only enlarge their own powers and independence, but would allow them to contribute to society in politics, in certain professions, and in educating their children as rational beings. Offering an alternative model of a national public education to Talleyrand's, Wollstonecraft sketches a system of co-educational day schools as well as education at home, inspiring love of home and the domestic life in both boys and girls. Lack of education, a frivolous attention to appearance and dress, she writes, are not vices exclusive to women. She uses an example to demonstrate the corrosive effect of frivolous values on those whom opponents of women's education assume to be naturally rational and virtuous. A certain class of men is one of the most engaging and amusing sections of the book, in which Wollstonecraft compares these frivolous soldiers to frivolous women, frivolous soldiers to frivolous women. The advantage of education, she says, lies not merely in enlarging women's spirits, capacities and independence, but also in fostering egalitarian relationships with men. Would men but generously snap our chains and be content with rational fellowship instead of slavish obedience, she writes, they would find us more observant daughters, more affectionate men, more faithful wives, more reasonable mothers, in a word, better citizens. While she recognised the importance of emotion, as we have seen, and the interdependence with reason, excessive attention to sensibility, she argued, meant that women were blown about by every momentary gust of feeling, making them the prey of their senses, unable to think rationally. Nor should women be excessively interested in their own sexual attractiveness, she argued, allowing themselves to be made sexual toys or playthings of men. then only, with their only recourse to influence by indirect, degrading means. She concludes, when women have been taught wisdom by education, they will be glad to give up indirect influence for rational privileges and the precarious sovereignty of an hour for those established rights which, independent of accidental circumstances, may afford protection to the whole sex. Well, what influence did Wollstonecraft have? Many assume that Wollstonecraft was condemned in her own time for such radical views, but the vindication of the rights of woman was in fact well received. Her work was instantly noted, well reviewed, and reissued in many editions. It's also been suggested that Wollstonecraft's writing had little influence on theorists, including early feminists, until her vindication was resurrected in the 20th century and republished in the 1970s. Well, this view is to discount, I think, the wider impact of her thinking. The feminist movement progressed slowly in fits and starts around the world, but in the late 18th and 19th century, it developed most systematically in the United States. Wollstonecraft's vindication, as noted, was published in several editions in America, including in Boston in the year it appeared in London. While the specific goals of feminist thinkers and activists have shifted over the years, Wollstonecraft's work and the principles upon which her vision of sex equality rested remained influential. And we have a copy here, it's hard to see the writing, but on the left, of the Vindication of the Rights of Woman, owned by Susan Anthony, the feminist activist, American feminist activist of the 19th century. Wollstonecraft took the leading ideas of the era, the logic of the Enlightenment, and turned these into an analysis of the circumstances of women, a feminist defence of women's liberation. And some have questioned whether the term feminist accurately applies to her thinking. The term, of course, is a relatively modern one. It didn't appear until the end of the 19th century and was certainly not used in her own time. It can only be applied retrospectively, but is it applied anachronistically? I do not think so. Wollstonecraft's ideas, as I have already suggested, have a continuing relevance. Hers is not a manifesto in which the key demands of modern feminism, political equality and equality in employment, for example, are prominent. These are concrete aspirations, giving content to claims of equality that were only just finding expression on behalf of men in Wollstonecraft's era. But the principles upon which Wollstonecraft's feminism rested, education for girls and equality in marriage, remain foundational. They underpin all other feminist goals. In April this year, I wrote a short opinion piece for the Sydney Morning Herald to draw attention to the fact that it is the 250th anniversary of Wollstonecraft's birth. I was pleasantly surprised that the editor of the opinion page was enlightened enough to see that the occasion was worthy of note, and grateful to him for taking my pitch. He encouraged in particular my making a case for Wollstonecraft's relevance today, something I found easy to do. I began by noting the assassination in that same month, in April this year, of a leading Afghan women's rights activist, assassinated by the Taliban. The assassination, I wrote, was yet another tragic reminder that equality between the sexes is far from accepted in the world today. In countries like Afghanistan, I continued, even the rights of girls to be educated or wives to leave their homes without their husband's permission are under attack. In Australia, as in the rest of the modern world, such rights are taken for granted. We may fall short on measures of equality such as pay scales or household burdens, but the belief that women are inherently inferior is at least no longer acceptable. For such progress we are indebted to the ideas of the Enlightenment and, above all, those of Mary Wollstonecraft. I continued, it was Wollstonecraft who gave the world the first sustained account of women's subordination and the means of combating it. Her vindication of the rights of woman is a vigorous defence of education for girls, equality in marriage, and women's right to work. Women, she argued, were enslaved not only by the laws and practices that defined them as property of their fathers and husbands, but in particular by the limited education they received. Their capacities of reasoning and understanding were enfeebled because they learned only to prepare themselves for marriage and a life of submission. This was damaging not only to individuals but also to society. Tyrants need playthings and slaves, Wollstonecraft wrote, and they will endeavour to keep women in the dark. Education and equality, she believed, would bring an end to such abuses of power. These ideas, I'm continuing an extract from my article, were the logical extension of the Enlightenment's challenge to tradition and its elevation of reason. Many people in the world today are nervous about such values, I wrote. They are afraid to appear insensitive to traditional practices or the belief systems of other cultures. Yet the long, hard struggle for women's rights teaches us that tradition and sexual inequality and sexual equality often collide. The legacy of the Enlightenment lies not only in the principles of human equality, I concluded, and ultimately democracy. It also lies in the invaluable advances in science and medicine enjoyed today in the West. In giving primacy to reasoning, the Enlightenment rejected superstition and folklore. It promoted science, research and experimentation. Among its greatest benefits is the power, I come back to my theme, to control reproduction and ensure women's survival through pregnancy and childbirth. Without these, women's ability to enjoy political and legal equality, to make choices in their lives and to reach their full potential is diminished. As with access to education and legal equality, these gains have not been felt everywhere, I wrote. Maternal death rates in some parts of the world are shocking. In sub-Saharan Africa, 1 in 22 women will die in pregnancy or childbirth. In Afghanistan, it is 1 in 16. Neonatal infant mortality is similarly elevated. These third world statistics expose an appalling lack of antenatal services and obstetric care. They are also revealing of cultures where girls are married very young, often before they are physically adult and certainly before they can exercise informed choice or judgment. The statistics speak of subordination, compounded by ignorance, lack of education and poverty. They tell a story of terrible but unnecessary suffering. That such tragedies are rare in the West today is due to progress in medical research and education, the legacies of the Enlightenment. When we find ourselves tempted to romanticize tradition or apologize for customary practices that subordinate women, we should remember this and give thanks to pioneers like Wollstonecraft. Well, after this piece appeared, I received a number of responses, both from members of the public as well as people I knew. By far the majority were positive and supportive, but not everyone was. A letter to the editor appeared soon after, written by a young woman, suggesting effectively that my comments on the oppression of women and the rates and patterns of obstetric mortality were anti-Islamic. I was implying, she wrote, that the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa stood for the whole Islamic world and that religion was responsible. Well, I want to take this opportunity to say something in reply. First, I want to note something about Mary Wollstonecraft that you will have also noted. Wollstonecraft based her argument for equality on the idea of God, the belief that God had created human beings equal. This was not just rhetoric on her part. Her observation was more than merely routine. She was not a religious skeptic. It may seem strange to us now, but she retained her religious faith and imbued her writing with it. Although many Enlightenment thinkers challenged and rejected religious belief, Wollstonecraft did not. Her target was not the church or religious beliefs. Indeed, her argument for women's equality rested significantly on her belief in the equality of all immortal souls. Whether or not one shares this view, my point here is that Enlightenment thinking does not in itself presuppose an anti-religious stance. What it challenges are arbitrary authority, blind tradition, superstition, and harmful custom. In my comments on the inequality of women and the values of the Enlightenment, I have no interest at all in making claims about religious beliefs. Religions have nothing in themselves to do with the problems for which Mary Wollstonecraft's thinking is still relevant. There is no monopoly in any one religion on oppressive or non-egalitarian ideas or practices. There is no monopoly either, religious or secular, in the value given to education and respect for human beings. The enemy of human rights, of women's rights today, is the enemy Wollstonecraft identified 2 centuries ago. Customs that stifle women's education and independence, practices that make women's bodies vehicles for men's interests, that enslave women and that turn them into property, the property of their husbands and the state. Customs and practices in the world today that see girls betrothed as women, married and pregnant before their bodies have fully developed, in cultures where medical assistance is limited or unavailable. Religion is not the cause. Poverty and lack of development are the reasons behind such deprivations and practices. The oppression and degradation of women, as well as women's own complicity in their subordination, are found in every country. We've seen this starkly recently in publicity surrounding the views of a young American singer called Lady Gaga, who denounces feminism and celebrates the sexual subordination of women. This is only the most recent manifestation in the Western world of the anti-feminism of today. But for all this, it is still in the poorer parts of the world that women suffer most, and where the simple values of education and health need greatest recognition and greatest protection. In her travels in Scandinavia in 1795, Wollstonecraft noted, amongst other things, the stunted, impoverished lives of the peasantry, in particular the lives of women. In one of her letters, she commented, "The more I see of the world, the more I am convinced that civilization is a blessing not sufficiently estimated by those who have not traced its progress." It couldn't have been said better, and it is a fitting note on which to end this lecture. The goal of equality, the blessings of science, the values of reason, the recognition of sympathy and imagination, the commitment to improvement and to progress, all core principles of the Enlightenment, all championed by Wollstonecraft, are incomplete and incoherent unless extended to all human beings. Even in the developed world, we are still not fully there. But we cannot deny that this world, the world in which Western women find themselves today, represents great strides in progress compared to the world in which Wollstonecraft lived. We must trace this progress, these steps towards justice, on behalf of both halves of the human race. We cannot afford to devalue it or to deny it to others or to let it slip through our fingers. Thank you.